The moment my boss laughed and called my thinking old school, something inside me went quiet in a way that scared me later. Not angry, not loud, just hollow. I remember the room clearly, the glass walls, the polished table, the faint hum of the projector, but what I remember most is how calm I looked. I even nodded, like he just shared a reasonable opinion. Inside, though, something folded on itself. I felt my chest tighten, not with rage, but with a strange numbness, as if my body had decided feeling anything would be a waste of energy. I replay that meeting often. What I saw was Ethan Miller leaning back in his chair, smiling the way people do when they think they've already won. What I felt was a slow-burning humiliation, not because he disagreed with me, but because he chose to do it publicly. What I didn't say was everything I knew about the contracts, the risks, the fragile systems only I understood. And what I pretended not to notice was the look on a few colleagues' faces. Not surprise, relief, as if my fall made space for them. I had given that company 12 years of my life. My name is Richard Coleman, and for more than a decade, my identity was tied to that place. I wasn't just an employee, I was the one people came to when things broke quietly, before they became disasters. I stayed late, fixed invisible problems, protected people who would never protect me back. Somewhere along the way, that became who I was: reliable, unshakable, necessary. Losing that wasn't just a career hit, it felt like someone had erased my reflection. After the meeting, I walked back to my desk the same way I always did. Measured steps, neutral expression. I answered emails, I finished a report. Anyone watching would have thought nothing had changed. But internally, it was like standing in a building after an earthquake, waiting to hear which wall would fall first. I realized, slowly, that this wasn't about ideas or modernization. It was about replacement. Ethan hadn't just dismissed my thinking, he had marked me as expendable. Here's the detail that still twists something in my gut. A week before that meeting, I had been removed from a critical internal system without being told. Access quietly revoked, no explanation. At the time, I assumed it was a mistake. Now I understand it was a test run. They wanted to see how much would break without me, how much credit they could take if it didn't. The humiliation didn't start in that room, it ended there. When my role began shrinking, it happened politely. Fewer invitations, fewer decisions. My responsibilities handed off in temporary adjustments that somehow became permanent. I watched younger managers, smart, ambitious, inexperienced, present ideas built on foundations I had laid without my name ever being mentioned. I told myself it didn't matter, that professionalism meant endurance, that loyalty would eventually be recognized. That belief cost me more than I realized. By the time I resigned, the damage was already done. No farewell meeting, no counteroffer. Just a half smile and a comment about fresh blood. Walking out of that building felt unreal, like leaving a life that had already forgotten me. I didn't feel rage then. I felt empty, stripped of status, of direction, of the future I assumed I was building. Something irreplaceable had been taken, and no apology could return it. People often ask why I didn't fight harder, why I didn't explode. The truth is quieter and darker. I was in shock, and beneath that shock was a clarity I'd never felt before. I finally saw the structure of what had happened, not as a misunderstanding, but as a design. Decisions aligned too neatly, timelines made too much sense. This wasn't an accident or a clash of styles, it was a plan. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? Because as I stood there, carrying a box of things that suddenly felt meaningless, I understood one final truth. They hadn't just underestimated me, they had already decided I was finished. And that was the moment I realized I didn't need to survive anymore. After I left, I didn't disappear the way they expected. I went quiet instead. There's a difference. Disappearing invites questions. Silence invites assumptions. And the assumption they made was that I was finished. Another outdated professional pushed aside by progress, licking his wounds somewhere far away. That belief became my greatest advantage. From a distance, I watched them celebrate, not openly at first, but in small, careless ways. LinkedIn posts about bold new direction, team photos where familiar faces were suddenly missing, mine among them. I noticed how relaxed they looked, how quickly my absence turned into background noise. Meetings ran shorter, decisions were made faster. They thought speed meant strength. I knew better. Speed without understanding just means you crash sooner. I stayed invisible on purpose. I didn't correct rumors. I didn't defend my name when someone quietly rewrote history. I let them believe I'd been the brake holding them back. Inside, that restraint took effort. There were nights I stared at the ceiling, replaying moments where I could have spoken up, could have exposed the cracks forming under their confidence. But revenge, I was learning, wasn't about release. It was about timing. The first small shift happened almost by accident, or at least that's how it looked to them. A former client from Manchester reached out to me privately. He said deliveries had started slipping, that promises were being made by people who didn't understand the operational limits I'd put in place years ago. I didn't gloat. I didn't warn him off. I simply answered his questions honestly, the way I always had. A week later, he delayed a renewal. Just a delay, nothing dramatic. But inside the company, that delay caused panic. What they didn't realize was that this client wasn't alone. Others were noticing the same things: small inconsistencies, overconfidence, a lack of institutional memory. I never told anyone what to do. I never suggested abandoning the company. I just stopped protecting it. For 12 years, I had been absorbing the impact of bad decisions before they reached clients. Now I stepped aside and let reality through. There was a moment I'll never forget. I saw Ethan Miller post a confident update about a major expansion milestone. The comments were supportive, applauding, but buried among them was a question from an industry analyst, one simple line asking how they planned to manage scale without increasing risk. It was the exact question I had raised months earlier. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't, because the answer no longer existed. That was my first real win. Not loud, not public, but deeply satisfying, because it hurt where they were weakest, credibility. And I could feel the shift begin. Emails grew more formal. Replies took longer. The easy confidence drained from their language. They didn't know it yet, but they were starting to feel watched. The hidden weakness revealed itself slowly. It always does. They had removed redundancy from critical systems to appear lean. On paper, it looked efficient. In practice, it meant there was no buffer when things went wrong. I designed those buffers. I knew exactly which failure would trigger a cascade and which executive would be blamed first. They thought they'd simplified the machine. What they'd actually done was make it fragile. I stayed patient. I declined invitations to speak publicly. I turned down offers that would have placed me in obvious competition with them. That restraint confused people. Some assumed I lacked confidence. Others thought I was afraid. I let them think that. Fear is a useful mask. It makes people careless. Behind the scenes, pressure was building. Missed targets, quiet arguments, a sense that something fundamental had been lost, even if no one could name it. I didn't push. I observed. Revenge, when done right, feels less like an attack and more like gravity. You don't have to force it. You just remove support and let things fall. Here's what mattered most. They still didn't see me as a threat. To them, I was history, a footnote, someone who belonged to an earlier version of the company they were eager to outgrow. That belief gave me room to move without being noticed. And that's when I understood the truth of what I'd started. This wasn't about getting even. It was about balance, about letting consequences catch up to decisions that had been protected for too long. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Because while they were busy celebrating the end of my influence, I was quietly watching the beginning of their fear. They thought it was over. I knew it had just started. The effects of that first shift didn't announce themselves. They never do. They moved quietly, like pressure building behind a sealed door. At first, it showed up as hesitation, emails marked urgent that stayed unanswered longer than they should have, meetings rescheduled, then rescheduled again, small inconsistencies that on their own meant nothing, but together formed a pattern I recognized too well. I watched Ethan Miller change without ever speaking to him. His public confidence remained, but it was thinner now, stretched over something brittle. Posts became more polished, more defensive. Words like resilient, adaptive, challenging market appeared where certainty used to be. Inside the company, people began double-checking decisions that would have been rushed through months earlier. That wasn't caution. That was fear trying to look professional. What surprised me was how revenge began changing me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt detached, almost clinical. The anger I expected never came. Instead, there was a steady narrowing of focus. I stopped thinking about what they had taken from me and started thinking only about outcomes, cause and effect, leverage. Silence had stripped something away, but it had also sharpened me. I was becoming someone who could wait without suffering. The mini-revenge had ripples. Clients didn't leave all at once, that would have been obvious. They stalled, asked for revisions, requested additional assurances. Each delay increased internal pressure. I knew how their quarterly targets were structured. I knew which deals were symbolic rather than profitable, and I knew which one was holding everything together. That deal had a deadline. A major partnership, one Ethan had personally championed, was supposed to close within weeks. It was positioned as proof that the company's new direction was working. Internally, it was fragile. Externally, it was being watched. Regulators, analysts, competitors. Everyone wanted to see if the promises matched reality. And reality, I knew, was missing key safeguards I had designed years ago. I stayed harmless, or at least that's how it looked. When former colleagues reached out casually, I kept my tone light. I wished them well. I avoided specifics. I never criticized leadership directly. That restraint made them underestimate me even more. People assume danger comes with noise. They don't notice the quiet ones until it's too late. Then the paranoia started. A mid-level manager abruptly left. No announcement, no explanation. A consultant was brought in temporarily. Ethan stopped delegating certain decisions and started hoarding information. These were classic signs, leaders sensing collapse before they can admit it to themselves. I'd seen it before. I'd prevented it before. This time, I let it breathe. Let me ask you this. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? Because pretending takes discipline. It means swallowing the urge to correct mistakes. It means watching people walk confidently toward cliffs and not calling out. It means understanding that control doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint. The time pressure tightened. The deal's due diligence phase exposed gaps, compliance questions, operational assumptions that no longer held. Normally, I would have been the one smoothing those over, translating reality into language investors could accept. Without me, answers came late, or wrong, or not at all. Each misstep fed the next. What no one realized was that I still had access. Not direct access, not systems or logins, something more dangerous. I had institutional memory. I knew where decisions had been documented quietly. Old risk assessments, archived emails, third-party audits that were never meant to resurface. Information that wasn't incriminating on its own, but devastating in context, especially now. I didn't touch it yet. I didn't have to. Just knowing it existed changed how I moved, changed how patient I could be. I understood that the company wasn't just vulnerable, it was exposed. And the closer that deadline came, the less room there was to maneuver. Ethan sensed something circling him, I could tell. He started asking the wrong questions, looking in the wrong places, searching for enemies who were louder, more obvious. He never looked my way. Why would he? In his mind, I was already gone. But the truth was simpler and far dangerous. I wasn't attacking them. I was waiting. Because when the right moment came, I wouldn't need to destroy anything. I just need to open a door they forgot I'd built. By the time the consequences became visible, it was already too late to stop them. That's the thing about slow revenge. It doesn't rush toward attention. It lets attention come to it. What had once been quiet tension inside the company began leaking into public spaces, and I watched it happen with the same calm I used to bring to crisis meetings, back when preventing damage was still my job. The first sign was subtle but unmistakable. A respected trade publication released a short piece questioning the company's recent expansion strategy. Nothing accusatory, just careful language, phrases like overextended and unverified assumptions. Those words landed harder than any accusation ever could. Analysts noticed, investors noticed, and suddenly the narrative Ethan had been selling didn't sound as certain as it once did. Inside the company, chaos wore a professional mask. Emergency meetings were labeled alignment sessions. Long hours were reframed as momentum. But the strain was visible to anyone who knew how to look. Senior managers began protecting themselves instead of the company. Information stopped flowing sideways and started moving vertically, tightly controlled. That kind of environment doesn't fix problems, it hides them until they rot. Through all of this, I remained outwardly unchanged. I declined interviews. I stayed out of industry panels. When my name came up, and I know it did, it was in the past tense. That distance gave me credibility without exposure. People assumed I was being dignified. The truth was simpler. I had set this in motion long before the meeting where Ethan laughed at me. I just hadn't known exactly when it would reach the surface. The confrontation came unexpectedly. Ethan called me directly. No intermediaries, no formalities. His voice was tight, controlled in that way people are when they're trying not to show fear. He asked if I'd been speaking to anyone, if I'd been involved in certain conversations. I told him the truth, carefully framed. I said I spoke when asked, that I answered questions honestly, that I hadn't signed any agreements that required my silence after leaving. There was a pause on the line. He knew he couldn't threaten me, not legally, not professionally. The power he thought he had was already gone. What he didn't realize was that this moment, this fear, was the outcome of a plan that began years earlier, long before I was sidelined. Back when I documented everything because I believed in accountability. Back when I built safeguards not just into systems, but into records. I had always assumed those documents were there to protect the company. Now they were simply telling the truth at an inconvenient time. Public consequences followed quickly. A delayed filing, a postponed announcement. Each delay fed speculation. Employees started updating resumes. Recruiters circled. Confidence once lost doesn't return quietly. It leaves gaps, and gaps invite questions. Ethan tried to regain control. He gave interviews emphasizing transparency. He promised internal reviews. He spoke about learning moments. But the damage had already occurred. The machine was still running, but the alignment was off. Every movement created more friction, more heat, more noise. The most telling moment came when a former colleague called me late one night. His voice was low, nervous. He asked if I'd planned this, if I'd known it would go this far. I didn't answer directly. I just said something that had become very clear to me. Some systems fail because they're attacked. Others fail because the person holding them together steps away. From that point on, there was no stopping it. The questions were out. The records were referenced. The timeline couldn't be rewritten anymore. What had been hidden as growth pains now looked like negligence, and negligence doesn't need an enemy. It collapses under its own weight. I felt no triumph, just certainty, the kind that settles in your bones when you know the outcome is fixed, even if the final moments haven't arrived yet. Because by then, the most important damage wasn't coming. It had already happened. By the time everything was exposed to daylight, I was closer to losing myself than I was to winning anything. That's the part people never talk about, the cost of staying patient when every instinct tells you to walk away. The pressure wasn't just on them anymore. It was on me. Every move I'd restrained, every truth I'd held back, had accumulated into a weight that followed me everywhere. The investigation rumors hardened into reality. Not a full inquiry yet, just enough scrutiny to make everyone nervous. Auditors asked for clarifications that should have been routine but weren't. Compliance teams requested documentation that no one could locate quickly. Each request felt like a ticking clock. I knew how fragile my position was, too. One wrong step, one emotional decision, and everything I'd set in motion could collapse back onto me. There was a moment, late, quiet, and deeply personal, when I almost ended it. Not my life, but the plan. I drafted an email explaining everything, laying out the failures, attaching the documents I'd kept. One message, one release. It would have been faster, cleaner. It would have felt like justice. I stared at the screen for a long time before deleting the draft. Because revenge done in anger doesn't restore dignity, it just transfers damage. Instead, I waited for the final alignment. That alignment came unexpectedly. A junior analyst, new, careful, and unaware of the internal politics, flagged an inconsistency in a risk disclosure. Something minor on its own, but connected to one of the archived assessments I remembered. The chain snapped into place. Once that thread was pulled, others followed. What had been speculation became pattern. What had been pattern became proof. The emotional cost hit me all at once. I realized how far I'd drifted from the person I used to be. The one who fixed things, who believed in loyalty, who assumed good faith. Revenge had demanded I become observant instead of helpful, silent instead of supportive. I didn't recognize that version of myself, and for a moment I wondered if winning was worth losing that identity forever. Let me ask you something honestly. If winning meant becoming someone you'd no longer recognize, would you still finish? Because that was the choice in front of me. Walk away now and preserve what was left of who I was, or see it through and accept the transformation as permanent. The last-minute reversal came not from me, but from them. Ethan tried to sacrifice someone else. A mid-level executive was quietly positioned as the source of the failures, pressured to resign, blamed for decisions he hadn't made. That move saved my plan, not because it worked, but because it exposed intent. The documents didn't lie. Timelines contradicted statements, and suddenly the narrative they were pushing couldn't hold. That's when Ethan finally understood. Not publicly, not in a meeting, but privately, in the way his communication changed, the way his messages stopped asking what was happening and started asking who. He never named me. He didn't have to. The realization was there, heavy and unavoidable. He knew the collapse wasn't random. It was guided. Everything was at risk then. My reputation, my future opportunities, my own sense of self. There was no clean exit left, only completion. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt exhaustion, and something colder beneath it, resolve without emotion. Because the moment he understood who was dismantling his world, there was nothing left to stop. The end was no longer a possibility. It was a schedule. The collapse didn't arrive with noise. No shouting, no dramatic exits, just a sequence of confirmations that turned certainty into fact. Resignations framed as personal decisions, announcements postponed indefinitely, partnerships quietly withdrawn. The company didn't explode, it folded, slowly, methodically, exactly the way fragile structures do when the pressure they've been hiding from finally reaches the center. Ethan Miller went first in everything but name. His authority thinned before his title did. Meetings stopped including him by default. Decisions were rerouted. Advisors replaced allies. When the official statement came weeks later, it was polite, restrained, and devastating. He was stepping down to support the organization during a transition. No blame, no defense, just absence. Reputation doesn't need to be destroyed loudly to be destroyed completely. Others followed. Careers stalled. Recommendations softened. Doors that once opened automatically stayed closed. No one was accused of crimes. No scandals broke headlines. That was important to me. This was never about humiliation for its own sake. It was about alignment, letting outcomes finally match decisions. the kind of justice that doesn't shout because it doesn't need to. When it was over, people asked what I had gained. The answer surprised even me. I hadn't reclaimed the years. I hadn't restored the version of myself that believed loyalty would be reciprocated. What I reclaimed was control, dignity, the truth, spoken without forcing my voice into rooms that had already decided not to hear it. What I lost was permanent, a career path that no longer existed, a reputation I had to rebuild elsewhere, an identity tied to being the man who held things together. That version of me was gone the moment they decided I was expendable. I didn't bring him back. I let him rest. What I reclaimed was quieter and stronger. The understanding that patience is not weakness, that silence, when chosen, becomes leverage, that people who underestimate you are often building the conditions for their own undoing. I didn't chase revenge. I let inevitability do the work. There was one final conversation with Ethan. Brief, private. He didn't apologize. He didn't accuse. He simply acknowledged what we both knew, that he had mistaken speed for vision, confidence for competence, and novelty for progress. I listened, not to forgive him, not to comfort him, just to confirm that the lesson had landed where it would hurt the longest. When the call ended, I felt nothing dramatic, no relief, no triumph, just a steady calm, the kind that comes when a long tension finally releases and you realize the cost has already been paid. I didn't celebrate, because there was nothing to celebrate. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a closing chapter. In the months that followed, I rebuilt. Elsewhere, differently, with fewer illusions. I chose my silence carefully. I documented everything. I trusted patterns more than promises. And when people asked about my past, I spoke plainly, without bitterness. The truth didn't need embellishment. It stood on its own. Here's the moral I carry now, the one that stays with me longer than any title ever did. The most dangerous people in any room are the ones who stop trying to be seen. Not because they're hiding, but because they're watching, learning, waiting. And when they move, they don't need permission or applause. I didn't win by destroying anyone. I won by refusing to be erased, by letting the consequences of their choices find them without my fingerprints on the door, by understanding that the loudest revenge isn't confrontation, it's completion. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.